Welcome to the One Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. 1 Nephi, chapter 17. Chapter Overview. Nephi and his fellows begin to travel east, basically from the heel to the toe of the boot that is the Arabian Peninsula, eating raw meat along the way and having babies. They come to a fruitful land that they call Bountiful, where God commands Nephi to build a boat. His brothers rebel, so he shocks them into submission, like Emperor Palpatine. Okay, my thoughts. In verse 2, we read that they lived on raw meat, which violates modern kosher laws. Since modern Jews have added to the Old Testament dietary laws, for example, the original law of Moses merely forbade boiling a kid in its mother's milk, but now modern Orthodox Jews won't even eat any sort of meat and dairy together at the same meal. I can't say with certainty that just because modern rabbis say that raw meat is non-kosher, is unacceptable, unclean, can't be eaten, that eating raw meat necessarily violates the law of Moses that forbids the eating of blood, but it seems likely that it would. So chalk this up as yet another violation of the law of Moses by the Book of Mormon people, even though we're told repeatedly that they obeyed God's commands and kept the law. In verse 4, we are now told that they have spent 8 years in the wilderness. And as I said in my previous post, most Mormons view this as being the first 8 years from the time Lehi left Jerusalem. But others view it as starting sometime after Lehi left. For example, when they left the Valley of Lemuel at the start of last chapter. And some people think that the 8 years includes the time at Bountiful and building the boat as well. Verse 5 contains an oddity. The word Iriantum. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly. Why would this one name be translated in the Book of Mormon? They usually don't translate any other name. It is said to be called that because it is the place of many waters. I'm wondering if what happened is Joseph Smith was looking through the Bible, looking for things to add to the Book of Mormon to make it sound more biblical and more scriptural, and he found examples in the New Testament where a place name is translated. We do find this with some regularity in the New Testament, but as far as I can recall, it doesn't happen in the Old Testament. It happens in the New Testament because the New Testament is written in Greek, and the original things that happened all occurred with Hebrew place names and the names of Israelites. So they would need to be translated into Greek in the New Testament. But we just don't see that in the Old Testament because it was written in Hebrew for a Hebrew audience, so there was no need to translate. We occasionally read things like the name of the city was such and such, but it was originally called thus and so. And that's because the place name changed when the Israelites came in, not because they needed to translate it. Following the Old Testament pattern of giving names from the Hebrew words, what should have been here is something like, thus we named it Iriantum because there were many waters there. And only if you understood the underlying Hebrew would you get the connection that Iriantum meant many waters. What we see here is equivalent to saying, so we named it Many Waters, which translated is many waters, because there were many waters there, which of course is utter nonsense. Verse 11 provides a slight humor break, at least when you read the 1830 version of the Book of Mormon, because it speaks of bellowses, not simply bellows. And that, of course, reminds me of Gollum in the Lord of the Rings series, speaking of those nasty little hobbitses with their rings in their pocketses. Verse 21 contains a likely discrepancy between the Bible and the Book of Mormon. In this verse, the people are complaining, and one of the things they complain about is, we might have enjoyed our possessions and the land of our inheritance. However, they came from Jerusalem, which is in Judah, but they are descendants of Ephraim. They are not descendants of Judah. Their land of inheritance was in the northern kingdom of Israel, which was now gone because the Syrians had demolished it. And this is the start of the Samaritans. You remember them from the New Testament. Verse 33 and following seems to be more of an apologetic to justify the European settlers taking the land of the American Indians than truly a discussion about the Israelites taking over the land of Canaan. The Canaanites were wicked, so God's chosen people, the Israelites, were given the promised land in their stead. And in the 1820s, America seemed like a promised land, and it truly was a blessed land that could produce much bounty. Plus, they had defied the odds to free themselves from the British rule, which seemed almost as miraculous to many Americans as the Exodus must have seemed to the Israelites. And since the Americans, who were God's chosen people obviously, were, like the Israelites of old, gradually driving out the Indians to possess their land, the parallels could be made very strong. Since the Canaanites were driven out because of their wickedness, then surely the Indians must have been wicked too to merit being driven out. In verse 41, after speaking of the fiery serpents in Exodus, it continues, "And the labor which they had to perform was to look, and because of the simpleness of the way, or the easiness of it, there were many which perished." Folks, we must keep this in mind when Mormons complain of the Christian concept of cheap grace and say that it's just too easy. All you have to do is believe and that's it. That's too easy. You need to remember 1 Nephi 17:41, because modern Mormons must add their own works to the completed righteousness of Christ. In verse 44, Nephi says to his brothers, "Ye also have sought to take away his life," that is, his father's life, "wherefore ye are murderers in your hearts, and ye are like unto them," the wicked people he's complaining about. Why is this verse important? Why did I mention it? Well, some Mormons claim that Nephi was within his rights to have murdered Laban, and that he was merely executing justice when he did so, because they say that Laban's attempt to murder Nephi and his brothers merited capital punishment, apparently without so much as a trial, because he wanted to kill them and intended to do that, and that was just as bad as actual murder. Well, here we see that Nephi calls his brothers murderers in your hearts, but he didn't execute them. Why not? If it was just and right for him to have done so for Laban, why not for his own brothers? Also, we read that Nephi is coerced into killing Laban, at least in part because Nephi remembers how important it is that he get the plates that contain the law and the history and the prophets, so that his people will have them in the future. And he reckons that it is acceptable to kill Laban, to kill one man, rather than that a whole nation perish in unbelief. That is, his people, his descendants, and his brothers' descendants, once they get to this new promised land. Yet we are told all throughout 1 Nephi that the Lamanites will become a wicked people and will do wicked things to the Nephites, who are supposed to be good people. So if it was right to kill Laban so that the people would have the law, so that they would be able to follow God's commandments, how much more right would it have been to have killed Laman and Lemuel and Ishmael's sons and all the rest of the grumblers and gripers and complainers, rather than taking them to the new world so that they would be a continual thorn in the side of the Nephites who were just trying to be good. 1 Nephi 17:48 includes the laughable statement, "They were desirous to throw me into the depths of the sea." The funny thing is that they were on the seashore with no boat. So just how were they going to accomplish throwing him into the depths of the sea when they were on shore without a boat? That would be sort of like being on a vast plain and wanting to throw someone off a cliff. The depths of the sea needs to be deep, not the shallows of the shore. Also in this verse, Nephi threatens them that God will strike them dead if they touch him. Yet, just a few years before, God was apparently unable to strike Laban dead and had to force Nephi to do it in order for Laban to die. Verse 50 amuses me. It says, "And I saith unto them," well, first, that's just horrible grammar. Even in the King James, just a lot of people don't know about it. We can read in the Bible, in the King James Version of the Bible, I say many times, and I said many times, but never I saith. But I digress. I saith unto them, but I digress. It says, and I saith unto them, if God had commanded me to do all things, I could do it. If he should command me that I should say unto this water, be thou earth, it should be earth. And if I should say it, it would be done. So, why didn't Nephi command the earth to become a ship, or the water to become earth, so that they could just walk to the Americas? After all, God had commanded Nephi to build a ship, and had given Nephi the power to speak things into existence. Hello, ego. So why didn't Nephi speak the ship into existence? Or at least the tools? No, he had to dig ore out of the ground and make a fire by striking two rocks together to create the tools so that he could build the boat. Really? This section also has implications, as did an earlier passage, for the Mormon conundrum of the fall, since they believe that God gave two contradictory commands so that Adam could not do them both, and was forced into sinning. If God always gives man the power to do what he commands, as this verse says, then Adam should have been able to do what God commanded, and should have been able to beget children and refrain from eating the forbidden fruit at the same time. So it's a contradiction in not exactly the Book of Mormon, but between the Book of Mormon and modern Mormonism because of later Mormon scriptures. Finally, after Nephi threatens his brothers with God killing them if they touch him, they don't dare touch him for the space of many days. Then God tells Nephi it's now safe for him to touch his brothers without them withering up and dying, and tells him to touch them, saying, I will shock them. Apparently it's some sort of proof that he could have killed them had he touched them in those days when he told them not to. But this reminds me of Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, shooting electricity out of his hands. Anyway, Nephi touches them and they are shaken and fall down before him and almost worship him, but he forbids it and directs them to worship God and to honor their parents.